Hello. Let's just swap these out. How's everyone doing? That was really intense. So, my name is Anita Sarkeesian. I am a pop culture critic. My work deconstructs the representations of women in the media through a feminist lens. I'm currently producing a series of long-form video essays on YouTube called Tropes versus Women, in which I analyze the portrayals of women in video games. This particular project has made me the target of an intense online harassment campaign perpetrated by a loosely coordinated group of very angry gamers. Over the last few years, I faced a daily barrage of sexist abuse. These attacks range from hacking and doxing attempts to rape and death threats made against me and my family. The near constant abuse has been and continues to be pretty awful. I have extensively documented and discussed how and why these cyber mobs form in various talks and articles. But today I want to dig a little deeper into the mentality that underpins the pervasive mistreatment of women both online and offline. Specifically, I'll be addressing 3 common ways women's professional and creative and intellectual work is dismissed. Those are the denial of women's earned accomplishments, the denial of women's life experience, and the denial of women's professional expertise. All 3 of these things work to reinforce gender discrimination and also make possible other more extreme forms of harassment. The dismissal of women's knowledge and contributions is a pervasive problem, but because it's more subtle than overt slurs and threats, many don't recognize it as a form of sexism. Even the men who engage in the active denial of women's accomplishments, experiences, or expertise may not consciously understand what they're doing, which makes it especially insidious and harmful. So today I'd like to use my own experience to illustrate how this phenomenon operates in practice, but keep in mind that unfortunately none of this is unique to me. So let's start with number 1, the denial of women's earned accomplishments. The professional accomplishments of women are consistently downplayed and dismissed in male-dominated fields, and we are often not given proper credit for our own work or ideas. So I'm going to start by telling you a simple truth. I founded and run my own nonprofit organization called Feminist Frequency. I started Feminist Frequency as a video web series in 2009, which I filmed in my living room, and the goal was to make feminist theory more accessible to women and girls. Since those modest beginnings, I've expanded my endeavor and built it into an official 501c3 nonprofit organization. In my role as executive director, I manage 2 full-time staff members and a whole host of consultants and contractors. Feminist Frequency still produces our educational media criticism, but we've also expanded our mission to include advocacy work around making the internet a safer, more welcoming place for people of all genders. In this pursuit, I regularly consult with major social media companies in developing solutions to curb harassment on their platforms. I'm quite proud of what I have built and what I've accomplished with this work so far. These are all facts. Thank you. Okay. So this is all factual information. Sadly, but not surprisingly, thousands of my detractors spend countless hours concocting ever more elaborate conspiracies to try and deny and undermine that reality. They do this in a myriad of ways, but here is one of the most popular. After the unexpected success of my 2012 Kickstarter campaign, I hired a co-writer and producer to help work on the new Tropes versus Women in Video Game series. Almost immediately, male gamers pounced on the fact that my newly employed producer, Jonathan McIntosh, happens to be male, and they began manufacturing a conspiracy theory in which I am not responsible for my own project. Images like these are repeatedly created and passed around to perpetuate this false narrative that my producer is a puppet master pulling the strings behind the scenes. It's a Wizard of Oz style fiction in which I am portrayed as merely a pretty face who mindlessly repeats the work of an ominous male mastermind. There's so many of these. These are attempts to discredit my work by insinuating that I am not who I say I am, that I do not have ownership of my intellectual work. The implication is that I am somehow not capable of operating my own organization. The assumption that women are not really responsible for our own professional accomplishments and therefore do not deserve our influence or success stems directly from sexist thinking. This is the same mentality that calls into question women's competence or qualifications with suggestions of getting ahead based on looks or being hired to fill a diversity quota or sleeping their way to the top. Number 2, the denial of women's life experience. Women often find the validity of our own life experience denied and dismissed. Regardless of our educational background or personal history in a field, we're told that we don't have the right to participate or even speak on particular topics. Here's another fact. I've been playing video games since I was 5 years old. My dad was a computer networking engineer, so our house was always filled with the latest machines loaded with all sorts of games. I was also fond of Nintendo and especially loved Mario and Kirby. Mario, Kirby, yeah. People play games in this audience? When I was about 10 years old, I launched a mini campaign to get my reluctant parents to buy me a Game Boy. And after a few months, I was finally able to convince them that a portable gaming device marketed to young men and called Game Boy was in fact appropriate for their little girl. Throughout my teenage and college years, I continued to play games on and off. Later in graduate school, I studied under a prominent games scholar, Jennifer Jensen, at York University, and took courses focusing on gaming and education. In short, I've been playing games for most of my life. The reality of this lifelong involvement with video games isn't convenient for my detractors, so they try to construct a different narrative using whatever fabrications they can muster. One particularly amusing conspiracy theory has to do with my original Kickstarter video. So here's a short outtake from that video in which I realized that making a fundraising pitch while playing Rayman Origins is way more difficult than you would think. Okay, so let's do it. Am I recording? Have you ever noticed that I can't play games and do this at the same time because I'm distracted? Okay. Okay, so these screenshots were lifted from that video and are still passed around as proof that I'm a fraud. Because the light on the Xbox logo is not clearly visible, they have deduced that not only that I am a fake gamer who just pretends to play games, but also that I don't even know how to turn on a controller. The reality that LEDs don't show up very well on video when filming in a room with bright sunlight just didn't occur to them, I guess. Truly some of the internet's finest detectives right here. The controller example is hilariously absurd, but it's also part of a larger pattern of behaviors in which some men go to great lengths to manufacture reasons why women don't belong in their subcultures and hobbies. We're then forced to go to ridiculous lengths to prove our credibility, and if we don't meet the arbitrary standards these gatekeeping methods demand of us, we're accused of being interlopers and fake geek girls or fake gamer girls. So here's a question for you. Are these games? Are you sure? You sound a little reluctant. Yes. Have you played some of these games? Do you like some of these games? Yeah, me too. These are some of my favorite games. And yet, in some gaming circles, playing these games does not make you a real gamer. There is a very gendered stigma attached to what are thought of as more casual interactive experiences. That sentiment actively works to alienate women and other marginalized communities from mainstream gaming, and frankly makes us feel unwelcome. Straight white men have the luxury of being able to embrace gaming culture unconditionally because so many games are made specifically for them. Women, by and large, don't have that same luxury. The male-centric products, marketing, and culture that the industry has cultivated over the past few decades has created the perception that being a real gamer means playing and loving violent, testosterone-fueled titles like Call of Duty, God of War, and Grand Theft Auto. As a result, I, like many women, have had a complicated relationship with video games. My engagement with gaming has ebbed and flowed over the years, but I keep coming back to it out of a genuine love for the potential of the medium and a belief that it can be better. So even though I was actually playing a lot of games, these kinds of games, I still, at various times in my life, refused to call myself a gamer, and I didn't identify as a fan of the medium as a whole, which I think is not that uncommon of an experience for young women. In spite of my life experiences, my detractors insist that my misgivings about the male-centric aspects of gaming culture means I shouldn't have a right to speak about games at all. The denial of women's lived experiences is a tactic used to position us as outsiders and invalidate our right to fully participate in male-dominated spaces. This is particularly true for women who dare to make men feel even a little bit uncomfortable. Gendered gatekeeping may or may not be the result of conscious sexism, but it is rooted in sexist thinking nonetheless. Number 3, the denial of women's professional expertise. When women do break through the barriers to participation in male-dominated spaces, we find our expertise ignored, contested, or outright denied. And we face intense scrutiny and aggressive demands that we defend our contributions in ways that our male peers do not. So here's one last reality. I'm an expert on the depictions of women in video games. In addition to playing games for most of my life, I've spent the last 3 years researching and examining the representations of women throughout the history of video games. I've discussed and analyzed over 300 different games in my Tropes vs. Women series thus far. As a leading expert in this field, I'm regularly sought after for media commentary on gaming topics and hired by developers and publishers to consult on upcoming titles. Women are socialized to be timid about our achievements, but I think it's important to own our success. I know my stuff, and I'm pretty good at what I do. Despite this fact, there's a widespread perception among mostly male gamers that I somehow still don't understand the games I analyze, and therefore intentionally misleading my viewers. Any Google search for my name will return thousands of YouTube videos from men who have obsessively combed through every frame of my videos in a desperate attempt to try and find that one smoking gun, which will then invalidate all of my criticisms once and for all. This magic bullet piece of evidence they seem to believe will thereby free them from having to consider the possibility that sexism may be a problem in gaming. Yeah. Needless to say, they have not found their smoking gun. My analysis is very well researched. It's double and triple checked. It has to be, given the intense level of scrutiny focused on my every word. This is one of the main reasons why each episode takes so long to produce. Still, in the comments under any internet article that mentions my work, you will find a flock of angry gamers pointing to one game in particular as that magic bullet supposedly proving my ignorance of all things video games. That game is called HITMAN Absolution. Now, I've spent quite some time playing this game, and it's a strange choice to try to use to debunk me, because it employs pretty much every sexist trope in the book. I mean, the game opens with a mission in which the player character shoots a naked, unarmed woman while she's taking a shower. And it only goes downhill from there. Okay, so the claim that I misrepresented this game is a particularly dishonest strawman argument. It originates from a 42-year-old YouTube user who, by all accounts, hasn't played the game at all, hasn't played Hitman at all, but is obsessed with ranting against feminism. His video entitled Anita Sarkeesian Busted is by far the most viewed video in the flourishing debunking feminist frequency subgenre on YouTube, which has itself turned into quite the cottage industry. His video is brimming with logical fallacies, but its popularity with male gamers does provide us with a useful example to deconstruct. So, if you'll indulge me for a moment, I'd like to first show you a brief clip of part of my original argument from my Women as Background Decoration miniseries. You're about to see 1.5 minutes from an hour-long analysis in which I discuss the ways in which sexual objectification is coded into game systems in many open-world or sandbox-style games. Here I'm addressing sexually objectified NPCs or non-player characters that are designed to be malleable, vulnerable, or disposable. I should note that this kind of misogynistic behavior isn't always mandatory. Often it's player-directed, but it is always implicitly encouraged. In order to understand how this works, let's take a moment to examine how video game systems operate as playgrounds for player engagement. Games ask us to play with them. Now, that may seem obvious, but bear with me. Game developers set up a series of rules, and then within those rules, we're invited to test the mechanics to see what we can do and what we can't do. We are encouraged to experiment with how the system will react or respond to our inputs, and discover which of our actions are permitted and which are not. The play comes from figuring out the boundaries and possibilities within the game space. So in many of the titles we've been discussing, the game makers have set up a series of possible scenarios involving vulnerable, eroticized female characters. Players are then invited to explore and exploit those situations during their playthrough. The player cannot help but treat these female bodies as things to be acted upon. because they were designed, constructed, and placed in the environment for that singular purpose. Players are meant to derive a perverse pleasure from desecrating the bodies of unsuspecting virtual female characters. It's a rush streaming from a carefully concocted mix of sexual arousal connected to the act of controlling and punishing representations of female sexuality. In-game consequences for these violations are trivial at best and rarely lead to any sort of fail state or game over. So a bunch of gamers were very unhappy about my analysis and allege that my video is deliberately misleading. They claim that the game does not encourage players to attack civilians, but instead punishes players for such actions. And therefore, by showing footage of the player character killing exotic dancers, that I was deceptively trying to make the game appear sexist. Everything about this claim is false. It's common for strawman arguments like these to focus on minute details, which are then blown out of proportion in an attempt to create a scandal. If you're not familiar with these kinds of games, I'm going to get a tiny bit technical about game mechanics for a moment, so bear with me. First, in my video, the exotic dancers are not being killed, they're being pacified, which is what the game calls it when you knock someone out without killing them. The game indicates this in the top left-hand corner of the screen. Next, the game does not punish players for non-lethal pacification. The point system in Hitman Absolution functions as a way to track performance stats. It has nothing to do with success or failure of the mission. All you need to do to pass a level is to kill your intended target and get out alive. Furthermore, the game provides ways to negate minor statistical penalties. In fact, if you keep watching my playthrough, you'll notice that the 140-point pacification deduction is nullified when the unconscious bodies are hidden inside one of the many containers that the game designers have placed in each level for that purpose, meaning there is no penalty. This is really basic stuff in the Hitman series. Finally, the assertion that the game does not encourage players to attack civilians is simply incorrect. It most certainly does, both implicitly and sometimes explicitly. Hitman Absolution is what's called a stealth sandbox game. That means it's designed to be played in many different ways. For example, each level includes multiple ways to kill each target. It's essentially a playground for creative violence. In fact, the only options provided for interaction with most characters are to either murder them or subdue them. Neutralizing NPCs is a core mechanic in the Hitman series. It's often necessary in order to clear a path to objectives or prevent a character who's seen you from raising the alarm. In this stage, for example, there's a specific challenge that explicitly encourages players to knock out a stripper and drag her body out of the line of sight. This action then allows the player to hide inside the stripper cake and wait for the targets to arrive before popping out and murdering them all in slow motion. The whole point of the game is to offer a wide range of possibilities for experimentation, which is why, even if you murder civilians, you don't get a game over. Saying that this game doesn't want players to interact with civilians in the only ways that are provided is like saying that Grand Theft Auto discourages players from stealing cars because sometimes they get a police wanted level for doing so in Grand Theft Auto. The developers obviously put a tremendous amount of work into designing and implementing these systems. They didn't do so with the hopes that no player would ever use them. As I said in my original video on the topic, game systems and everything in them, including sexually objectified female characters, exist to be played with. So there's absolutely no truth to the allegation that I misrepresented this game. Okay, enough of that. Those who repeat these false claims do not understand my argument, or perhaps more likely, they are just trying to pass off bad faith strawman arguments as legitimate criticism, while making no real attempt to engage with the substance of my analysis. Now, obviously, good faith, respectful, constructive criticism of women's work can be useful and valuable, but that's not what we're talking about here. Accusing women who are in fact experts in their field of ignorance or intentional deceit because you don't like the conclusions they reach in their work is used as a way to discredit and discount perspectives that challenge the status quo. Automatically assuming ignorance when women speak on video games, technology, science, politics, or other subjects typically associated with male-dominated arenas is a form of sexism. Now, of course, the conspiracies and straw man arguments I've outlined in this talk are without merit and not even worth responding to on their own. However, they do illustrate an underlying pattern. The denial of women's accomplishments, experiences, and expertise works to underpin gender inequality and lays the foundation for other forms of harassment and abuse by providing a self-justifying narrative for these behaviors. So in my case specifically, men can tell themselves a story in which their anger and hostility towards a feminist games critic is justified because she's just the puppet of a man, or she can't even turn on a controller, or she lied about Hitman. And whether in workplaces or online spaces, men who undermine and belittle women justify it to themselves by saying, I'm not doing this because she's a woman, it's just because she's unqualified, incompetent, or undeserving of her position. This is a delusional but self-justifying fiction in which men convince themselves that women deserve any mistreatment they receive. But I want to stress that the undermining of women's work is not only a problem when it results in harassment. The constant resistance women encounter in male-dominated spaces may often be subtle, but the repercussions of these discrediting tactics are far-reaching, and the emotional, psychological, and professional toll these constant denials and attacks take on women are severe and impossible to quantify. All of this is a contributing factor to the abysmally low ratio of women working in traditionally male-dominated fields, particularly those involving technology. Women learn to doubt their own talent and skills, internalizing the belief that they don't belong in these spaces. The constant undermining and microaggressions, as well as straight-up harassment, pressure many women to abandon their professional field altogether. And by ensuring that these fields remain places in which women are not viewed or treated as equals, these devaluing tactics work to shore up the status quo, limiting the opportunities for women to gain entry to these spaces and actively maintaining male dominance, making it impossible to reach true gender equity. What's insidious about these more subtle forms of sexism is that oftentimes men don't even realize they're participating in them. As the great Howard Zinn famously said, "You can't be neutral on a moving train." Men must step up and counteract the doubt and marginalization that so often greets women's voices. Of course, this is easier said than done. It requires men to do the conscious and intentional work of listening to women, recognizing women's contributions, and actively giving women the benefit of the doubt. The cultural norms of male-dominated spaces can be changed, and those spaces can be transformed into equitable environments that are welcoming, supportive, and respectful for people of all genders. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Now, one of the breakout sessions that follow will speak directly on the topic how to end online harassment. So luckily we don't have to solve it now in like 1 minute.
Oh, good.
But would you like to send us some thought into that conversation? Where do we start?
Oh, that's a big question.
Yes. Sorry.
Yeah. You know, I think one of the things that's really important to understand is that whether you're being targeted or not, or know someone who is or not, we are all responsible for changing the status quo, right? It's not enough to just not like it. We actually have to actively speak up and actively participate in challenging these oppressive norms. So I'd say we all need to participate. We all need to collectively work together to make a difference.
So also pay more attention and listen more. And
Absolutely.
I guess also especially maybe be more aware about whether we're participating in or targeted by subtle sexism as well.
Absolutely, and that's the thing is, you know, I said a couple times in this speech that it's hard to recognize and it's hard to know that we're doing it. So listening to women, giving them the benefit of the doubt in terms of their experiences, and when they say, hey, you're doing something kind of sexist, that maybe you should take stock in that instead of just being immediately defensive.
Very good. Cool. Thank you ever so much.
Thank
Anita
you.
Sarkeesian.